everyone. Thank you very much for joining tonight. I'm just going to go over a couple quick Zoom etiquette pieces before we hop into the presentation today. So my name is Taylor Mead. I am the Director of Health Programs for Special Olympics New York. And you have all hopped on to one of our virtual health and wellness forums. So these forums are meant to be a space to give folks who are supporters of people with intellectual disabilities, who are people with intellectual disabilities, who are coaches, parents, staff members of agencies. We like to try to provide information to any and all groups, regardless of their involvement with Special Olympics. So tonight's presentation is a really great topic. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction here. However, before I do that, I just want to remind everybody to please keep yourself on mute during the presentation. You will have the opportunity at the end to get the chance to ask some questions. There are going to be a couple of, group discussion opportunities as well. So we very much encourage you to be a part of those, whether that is something that you're comfortable utilizing the chat for, or able to come off of mute in those situations. This is being recorded for posting later on to be able to share with others in our community. However, I will be making sure that I remove your name and picture from the recording. So nothing that you say is going to be labeled as you. So we will make sure that that is kept anonymous throughout the presentation. So tonight we are lucky enough to have Emily Tennant-Koller, who is going to give us a presentation regarding sexuality and developmental disabilities. So the goals of the presentation tonight are to examine barriers to talking about sexuality, gain knowledge about sexuality and developmental disabilities, acquire and practice skills in communicating about sexuality with young and grown children. So just a little background on Emily. So Emily is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Supervisor at New View Alliance, which is an agency that serves children and families experiencing mental health and out-of-home care needs. And she also is a sexuality trainer. So Emily, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Taylor. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I am going to just share my screen, and then I will give you a little bit more information about myself so you can understand kind of where I'm coming from and how I got into this. So I am the parent of children with disabilities myself. Those disabilities range from autism to ADHD to dyslexia. I have a child with a nonverbal learning disability. So a wide range of disabilities, intellectual and learning disabilities, and just kind of neurodiversity in general. And prior to that, prior to becoming a parent of children with disabilities, I worked in many different kind of sexuality areas, including in graduate school, I worked with students on exploring their sexuality and healthy sexuality and things like that. So it's something that I've been doing for a very long time. So that's kind of my background, and we're going to talk about a lot of different things today. This training does work best if people are able to share their own thoughts and ideas. It also is very helpful to other parents to hear some things that you may have tried or things that have come up within your life, or if you are a staff member, things that you may have experienced. So it is really good to share your knowledge. So we will get to that in points. And if people aren't willing to share, that's totally fine. We just will be done a little bit sooner, which I can give you back some of your night if that is something. And just a little bit of a heads up, my kiddos are actually upstairs watching a movie. So if you hear yelling, they're just getting excited about watching their Marvel movie. So hopefully they won't make any noise, but you never know. So this training does come through ElevatUs. If you have not heard of ElevatUs, it is an organization that basically works directly with people with developmental disabilities about healthy relationships and sexuality. And they also train people, whether that might be staff. I've provided trainings in group homes before for staff. It's a lot of different types of information that can be given, but the training itself was created through ElevatUs. Previously, when I was first asked to do this training, I was the education and training coordinator at Parent Network of Western New York, which obviously is in the Western New York area of New York State. But that is kind of how I got involved in this. So that organization is still very much involved in working with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So why is it important to have conversations and to talk to people that have intellectual and developmental disabilities about relationships, sexuality? And remember, everybody has a sexuality. Sexuality is just a term that means somebody as a sexual being. So there are a lot of reasons. The first main reason being that when you are in classes that might be classes that are life skills classes, they might be students that are alternatively assessed. These might be students that are not on degree tracks, but they might be receiving a certificate instead of a diploma in school. There's often no sexuality education for individuals that are in those class types. And that you might have a student who is in that type of class from third grade all the way through till their 22nd birthday. So throughout all that time, they might not have received any kind of sexuality education. And sexuality education doesn't just include anything related to sex. It also includes things like, how do you take care of your body? How do you learn about puberty? How do you learn about safety on the internet? How do you learn about safety in relationships? So these are people who might not have received any sort of education regarding that topic at all while they were in school, which, as we know, that's just part of being human. Last year, I provided a 22-week curriculum as a program in one of the school districts within our county. And these were young adults who were between the ages of 15 and 21. They'd never really had any of this sort of education, and they had so many questions, and there was so much that they wanted to know. And it was really great to give them the opportunity to be able to ask questions, because their questions were so great. They exist in the same world that we do, right? So they see the same things on TV. They might see the same things on the internet. They might hear the same things with their friends, but they are not necessarily given the same opportunity to ask questions. And some of the questions that they asked were just so great. And it was really, really fun because I got to go every week, but you could tell that they were just really, really, really needing someone to be able to talk to about this stuff. Another reason why it's really important is because information about anything helps combat unhealthy messages from the culture around them. Again, like I said, young adults, they are in the same world that people without intellectual and developmental disabilities are. So they might be watching the same TV shows. They might be integrated in classrooms. They are hearing all the same things that kiddos that do not have intellectual and developmental disabilities do. Things on the radio, song lyrics, and they might not know where they can go to ask questions and to also learn about what is appropriate information for their age range. It also normalizes the topic because everybody has a sexuality, whether you have an intellectual or developmental disability or not. Everybody has a sexuality. And although we don't always like to think about that, it is true. And we know that it's true because a lot of times what we see is as people are getting older, there's this fallacy that if you have an intellectual disability, that you don't want a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a partner, that you're not interested in those sorts of things. And then we often see people getting taken advantage of. There's a lot of research out there that shows that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities report being lonelier than their counterparts. And some of that has to do with the fact that it's really just not normalized that they can have relationships too. And that's one thing that we really want to do. Another reason to talk about it is that it shows that your kids, that they can trust you. You want them to come to you with questions, right? Like, for a little reference, my kids are 14, 12, 11, and 10. And when they have questions, I want them to come to me so that I can give them proper information. I can give them the right information. I can give them age appropriate information. Our kiddos are out there, they're riding the bus, right? Like, oh, the bus is like the worst place for information because there's no adult supervision. They're just, kids are just doing whatever they want to on the bus. And so if your kids don't know that they can come home and talk to you about maybe this word that they heard on the bus, or someone said something or did something to them on the bus, we want them to know that they can trust us. It's also a really great opportunity to express your own values to your kids. If you believe that people should be in a long-term loving relationship before they engage in any kind of physical activity with each other, that's something that you can express to your kids if they have an intellectual and developmental disability. If we just pretend that that doesn't exist for them, we're ignoring a big piece of who they are. And those things are going to happen anyway. And we want them to be able to know, oh, okay, well, my mom told me this about having sex, and this is what we think is important in our family. One of the young women that I was working with in this class, it was very clear that her parents had given her a lot of information. And she was always just willing to share what they had told her. And they obviously cared very much about being honest with her. But you could see that she had really absorbed their values, because she would say things like, well, I don't really think it's important to have a boyfriend until after I'm 18. And so that was something obviously that her parents had told her and that she really internalized. And she knows, okay, this is what my parents value. This is what my family values. Another important reason is because when we increase sexual health and sexual health information, we reduce sexual abuse. When we teach children, young adults, this is true of people that do not have intellectual and developmental disabilities, but it's really important for people that do, because when we teach them about sexual health, we give them a language to use if there is abuse happening. If you have a 15-year-old who's saying, well, on the bus, one of the bigger kids, he keeps asking that to have some of my cookie. If you've never taught this person that the word vagina, if you've never taught them the word vulva, they don't know how to tell you that that teenager, that senior, is touching their private parts. They don't know how to tell you that. So it's super important that we're giving a language to use to be able to reduce any sort of abuse that they might experience. And people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, do experience abuse at higher rates than their counterparts. And part of that is a lack of information. Okay, so what does sexual health really mean? So it means a lot of different things. Some of it we've mentioned already, but we want people just in general to feel good and understand their bodies. And people who do that tend to have higher self-esteem. They tend to feel better about themselves. They feel better about their gender identity, their sexual orientation, whatever that might be. We want them to have relationships that are positive, not exploitative. You know, it's not necessarily something that we like to think about, but it is definitely a fear for parents that, you know, you have a child with an intellectual developmental disability. As they're getting older, you worry that they might be taken advantage of in many different ways. Monetarily, they might be taken advantage of by friends. They might be taken advantage of in any sort of way that has to do with their sexuality as well. And we want them to have information to make healthy decisions, and we want them to have self-esteem so that they feel good about themselves and they know what it is that they think is important, and again, your family values. We want people to avoid any sort of sexually transmitted infections, any unintended pregnancies, other challenges that come along with that. One reason why the school district contacted me to do this topic with their class, they only have one class. Well, they have two classes, but they are small enough that they could go together, was because they had a pregnancy in their program and they had a young adult getting married when they left the program. So these things happen, and we want people to be able to be in charge of what is important to them and to have a language to be able to talk about it. And at the end, I will put a bunch of resources in the chat that people can utilize. I think usually you can have access to them, and I can also send them to Taylor so that she can send them out as well to people. There's a lot of really great information in them. And some of the statistics out there are scary, and it's important that we know about it. Okay, so some of our goals today is that we really want to examine some of the barriers that we have to talking about sexuality. And yes, even though I do talk about this for a job, it's not always something my own kids don't want to talk to me about this. They don't want to have these conversations with me. So there's definitely barriers that are out there. We want to gain some knowledge about sexuality, sexual abuse, and developmental disabilities. And then we do want to be able to practice some of those skills. I know that can be harder with a virtual training, but I definitely will give people the opportunity to practice. And if that's something that you're not interested in, then we can kind of move on, and you can hopefully have the skills to practice that on your own or with others that you feel comfortable with. Okay, so in this training, we realize that people have differences of opinion. I may say something that you don't agree with. You may say something that I don't agree with. Somebody else might not agree with it, but we're going to understand that people have different opinions, and that's okay. And we're going to respect those opinions. Confidentiality. What I like to say is you can leave this training with lessons, but we don't leave this training with stories. So we're not going to go out and be like, oh my God, I was in this training and this person told me. And then you give all this identifying information, and then you realize that it's very possible that that person might know the other person. We just don't want that to happen. So you leave with the lessons that we learn in here, but we try to keep any private or confidential information in the training. There is absolutely no such thing as a stupid question. There's also generally not ever a question that I won't answer. I haven't had one yet. we had a lot of really interesting and great questions from the group of young adults that I did this with. And some of them are very, very uncomfortable. And that is okay. That's what this training is about, right? And then we just want to have fun if possible. It can be a really heavy topic. It can be an embarrassing topic. We used to have what I would call like giggle fits. So the kids we'd be talking about something and we'd say like the word penis and they would lose their minds and we'd be like, okay, giggle fit time. And they'd just do a bunch of giggling and then we'd get it out of our systems and then we'd be able to move on with the topic. So we just want to have a little bit of fun if possible. Because it can be a difficult topic to talk about, especially if you're talking to your kids, right? So I would really so this says in the breakout rooms, I don't quite think there's enough of us to do breakout rooms, but if you have a piece of paper or if you have like on your phone, you have notes or anything like that, I'd really like you to take a few minutes. I'm going to set like a 3-minute timer. And I would like you to really think about what has been what was the primary message that you received about sexuality growing up? So like what was your family's take on sexuality? What did you talk to your parents about it? Did you talk to siblings about it? What was kind of the message that you got while you were growing up? And I'm going to mute and I'm going to give everybody about kind of 3 to 4 minutes to think about this. And then hopefully people will come back and report a little bit. Okay, and we'll come back together. I know that really people don't have their cameras on. Does anybody feel comfortable sharing what was one of the primary messages that you received about sexuality while growing up? If you do, you can either type in the chat or you can unmute.
I could actually say a little bit of my experience, I guess.
Great. Who is this? Who?
I'm a mom. So I kind of learned the hard way. I went one day to school with a condom thinking that it was a balloon. I blew it and everybody was laughing about me. Then a few weeks later, I had my first period. Never knew about it. Nobody spoke to me about it. The fact that I was from foster care to like my grandma's care, my grandmother wasn't open about sexuality. And then the other thing is that I was sexually abused as well by a family member. So I had to learn so many things all at once. And it wasn't really until I was a grown-up that I learned about sexuality, like the actual word, everything. So it was really hard on me. I have 4 boys at home. 3 of them, they are very open to talk about things with me, not with their father. But I do have one that is under the spectrum. He's nonverbal, and it is a little bit hard on me. That's why I'm here, because I want to know information on how, as he is a nonverbal, I could approach to him on certain things, like grooming or how to talk about puberty to him, or we need to do this on private and stuff like that. But at least for me, my experience, I had to learn everything on my own. It's not like somebody teaching me or nothing like that. So it was really rough.
You learned that sexuality was really hard and complicated, and that no one was going to talk to you about it.
Right.
Yeah, that's really difficult. Thank you for sharing.
No problem.
That, some really difficult things, and thank you for participating in the conversation. And we will talk a little bit more about the nonverbal part and kind of how we can, because I always like to think of it as like, yes, the young person might be nonverbal, but it doesn't mean that they're non-hearing or even that they're like non-paying attention, right? So like he's probably listening and hearing a lot of the stuff, but just might not be able to get any of it out. So we'll definitely have some conversations about that. I just want to read a couple of the things in the chat out loud. So someone had said, I grew up being told not to have sex or I will get pregnant. My grandmother told me if you kiss, you become pregnant. That must have been complicated, right? And confusing. Not to have a boyfriend or be in a relationship. Never knew about my period when I first got it. All I knew was that you see blood when you pee, you have your period. Somebody was told they can love whoever they want to. It doesn't have to be the opposite sex. So it sounds like maybe a little bit more open. My parents avoided talking about sex at all costs. I learned about my period when I asked my mom about it, and she handed me a pamphlet called Growing Up and Liking It. No discussion though. Isn't that funny that after all that time you still remember the name of the pamphlet? It must have been very impactful. Oh my gosh, when I was growing up, my dad told me and my 5 sisters that his belt was our boyfriend. My mother was worse. She was so strict that we got beaten for just talking to a guy. I was so afraid to even talk or look at a guy. My parents avoided talking about sex as well. My parents were strict about me hanging out with guys, so I was afraid to tell them. Had an older sister, learned a lot from her. My family stressed abstinence. These are all really interesting. First of all, I would point out that I think that most of the people that are typing in here, although I can't be 100% sure and I don't want to assume, are women. And so much of it revolved around being pregnant, right? Because we're so worried that someone is going to get pregnant, especially when they're a young adult, that the primary message is don't get pregnant. The primary message isn't in like, you should find like a loving person who really cares about you and listens to you and, you know, wants to talk about your feelings and is aware of their own feelings. Like the primary message is don't get pregnant, right? And I think that that's probably pretty accurate. Again, not making assumptions about what anyone's age is or anything, but I'm 43. And so that was absolutely a primary message when I was growing up. I think maybe it has changed a little bit, but I do still think it's always an onus of the young women to just be like, well, don't get pregnant. That's the primary fear that people have, I think. Not, don't get a sexually transmitted infection or, you this is what abuse looks like, right? Like it's just, don't get pregnant. And I think that's can still be true. Somebody was told not to watch movies or shows that have sexuality, even though it wasn't porn. So any sort of sexuality, it sounds like. Does anybody else want to kind of contribute to what they were told growing up? I think those are probably pretty common. One thing that was really great about the young adults is the young men that were in the class that I taught. They had a lot of questions about periods and cycles. We actually did both male and female puberty. And they said that they had asked adults in their life and they just really had never had it explained to them. So they were very, very happy to know kind of the cycle, but also they were really happy. Like I brought in pads and we showed them how they went on underwear because they were very concerned that the women were bleeding and that they didn't know how like the bleeding was stopped or like they didn't want it to get on their clothes. Like it was a very wholesome questions that they had, but really something that nobody had ever explained to them before. And they, they have women in their lives that they love and they wanted to know. And the young women had questions about, masturbation, and they had questions about erections. Like there were so many questions, right? But I think that's because in our society, it's not really something that we talk about. And we just assume that because someone has an intellectual or developmental disability that they aren't paying attention or that they don't have those questions, and they very much do. So these primary messages that we receive are also primary messages that they are receiving, but they might not be able to ask questions. They might not have neurotypical friends who can answer the questions for them. They might not know where to look for questions. So people might be going on the internet and looking up questions, and that's just not a great place to go. We all know that. There's just way too much on there. So this is all really important stuff to know about how we got our messages about sexuality. So what are some reasons why it might be difficult to talk about this with our kids, or if you are a staff member, to talk about with your staff member? Can anyone kind of think about what might be some reasons why it's difficult to talk about this? And feel free to say it out loud or put it in the chat. I'll read them out loud if they go in the chat. It's embarrassing. Yeah, it can be really embarrassing. Especially if no one's ever talked to us about it, right? So like all those messages that we just heard that we got it's something that, just don't get pregnant, right? And that's kind of where it's been left, but it's embarrassing. Children look at the parents as enforcers, right? Like we are the rule makers, we're the people who enforce the rules. So how could we possibly, if we tell you about something like sex, then, oh yeah, somebody said it, you may be giving them ideas that they hadn't thought of, right? Somebody said that their child is verbally impaired, so they might be non-speaking, so they might not be asking these questions, right? It doesn't mean that you're necessarily even not talking to them. They might not be asking the questions. Maybe afraid of their parents' reactions if we're talking to our clients or students. Absolutely. We see that a lot, right? And the whole idea of like burying your head in the sand, like if you work at a group home or you work with young adults and these young adults are asking questions and you give them honest answers, or you try to be as honest as you can, and their parents do not want them to know these things, you feel kind of like you're put into a hard place. Parents might freak out if somebody is pregnant unexpectedly, or parents might think we might get raped. That is absolutely a concern. I would say that's probably a concern that as a parent I would have more if I wasn't talking to my kids about this. It's absolutely a concern. And in 2024, there's still taboo. Yeah, there's still a lot of, we don't have a very healthy relationship with sexuality. In the United States, maybe in other places as well, but I'm not 100% sure because I don't live there. Kids don't think that once we were kids ourselves and we don't know what we're talking about, we're too old-fashioned. This only happened when we were younger. Times have changed. Yeah, those are absolutely true things, and might be reasons why it can be hard to talk to your kids about these things, because they think, oh, my parents don't know anything, right? Yes, that is definitely true. As I mentioned, my kids' ages, they think I know nothing, even though I do this for a job. They think I don't know anything. So yes, that is absolutely true. They call me an old fogey. That's their favorite thing to call me. It's fogey. So I think that although all of those are absolutely reasons why it can be hard to talk to our kids about sex, I think the one especially that stands out that I think I see quite often is like if you're talking to them about sexuality or really anything related to bodies, like that you're giving them ideas that they didn't have. And I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions, because they have thought about these things. I got a call probably about a year or so ago from New York City. There was a woman who worked within a housing program, and she had a young man with autism, mostly non-speaking, and they were getting to the point where there were like criminal charges that were going to be brought against this young man because he was just constantly seeking like sexual stimulation, and whether it was from female staff or out in the community, wherever it was. And there was a really high concern for his safety because he was so stimulatory seeking. And they were like, you know, what can we do? And I asked them if anybody had taught him how to masturbate, because if it's something that he didn't know, it was clearly something that he was trying to have happen. And it was a major concern that he had already been arrested, but there were no charges pressed. So it was a major safety concern for this young man. And he was going to be 19. He was aging into an adult system. And so these are the issues that we face, right? So we think, oh, we're not going to talk to them about this because, you know, we don't want to put ideas into their head. But regardless of what someone's intellectual age may be, their physical age is always related to what their actual physical age is. So you have someone who is 14, 15, 16 years old, whose body is going through the same hormones, the same emotions as somebody who is that age who does not have an intellectual developmental disability, is regardless of whether their intellectual age is 3, 4, or 5 years old, their body is not. And so they're experiencing the same things, and it is hard and it is confusing. And it can be really difficult if they're not getting information in the way that is appropriate for them and that is steeped in your own family's values, right? So there's so many reasons it can be hard and difficult, but that is, I would say, a big one. Okay, so what is our role as parents and people who care about these kids? Someone said there might be a sexual predator. Yeah, absolutely. One of the ways that we can protect kids, people, young adults from sexual predators is by giving them information, right? It's by providing that information. So what is our role? Our main role is to provide information in an appropriate way. So if you walk in and you see your child is maybe fondling themselves, touching themselves in their private parts, not walking out and be like, oh my God, that's so disgusting, you need to put that away. Like, that puts a value on what they're doing, and that creates a shame, right? So that might be a case where we have a conversation about where is it appropriate to do that, and what are private versus public spaces. We had that conversation a lot with the young adults that I work with. What is a private versus a public space? A private space is just that, a private space, and it can be confusing, right, for them, because if they maybe live in a group home setting, they may share a room. That's not a private space, right? A private space it's like the bathroom when you're alone in the bathroom. That's a private space. The living room, not a private space, right? So we have to be very specific about that with people, because they have to know that it's okay in a way that is appropriate, right? So it's our job to listen. So if they have questions, or we notice that they're making maybe a lot of sexualized comments, maybe they're asking a lot of questions, and some of the questions are appropriate, some of them are not. We're going to listen, and we're going to listen, you know, as objectively as we possibly can. I try to really practice like neutral face, because it's not something that is natural for me. So I try to practice like neutral face, and I do a lot of. Okay, what is interesting to you about that? Can you tell me more about that? Practice for ourselves, right? Like, it's totally okay. You might want to practice with a friend or a partner. Just like practicing how to listen kind of objectively to some things that might make you uncomfortable. One of the hardest things for humans is to be uncomfortable. It's one reason we don't talk about these things, is because they're uncomfortable. So if we can learn to kind of like sit with that discomfort, and we're going to feel a lot better, right? So modeling I find this to be one of the most natural ways to kind of get information across when someone might have an intellectual or developmental disability. This might be if you're watching a TV show with them. Like say you're watching young adult a TV show, maybe. I don't know if anyone's heard of the show Heartstoppers. I love it. It's on Netflix. I watch it with my 2 oldest kids. There's a lot of opportunity there to really talk about the show and the relationships and to say, oh, it seems like they're really listening well to each other, or they're a young couple who seems to care a lot for each other. And then you give some specific examples and they understand, oh, okay, well, these young people have a relationship with each other, right? And to talk about that. Someone mentioned the show Love on the Spectrum in the chat. Love that show so much. I've seen all the seasons. We'll talk about it a little bit later too, but it's such a great show. If you have not seen Love on the Spectrum, there's 4 seasons. You should check it out. I also really like that show because the first 2 seasons are set in Australia and there's 2 seasons set in the United States, and you can absolutely see the differences in the way that neurodivergent people are treated in the 2 different geographic areas. Is fascinating. There's also one called Down with Love, that is people that have Down syndrome, also looking for partners. So the first one is people that are autistic looking for love, and then the other one is people with Down syndrome. It's great. I watch it with my kids too, so really fun. Modeling, like also modeling relationships. Like if you have a partner or somebody that you really care about, modeling what a healthy relationship looks like to them, because you can talk about or tell them things all that you want, but if you are not modeling it, it's really hard for them to picture and understand, like, what does that actually look like? Answering questions honestly and responding in a positive way about sexuality. Being kind never costs us anything. And that is why I think, like the example that I used a minute ago about like walking in when someone was doing, maybe touching themselves privately, like if we respond in a way that feels shameful, that creates shame. And if anyone ever has read anything by Brene Brown, you will know that shame is one of human beings' biggest responses and feelings, because shame creates a lot of anger. And if we're shaming somebody about those feelings that they're having that are very natural and very normal, it creates like a really negative response. And it's one of the reasons why then people won't continue to like ask questions or respond or really open up about things, and then they do things privately, and then they do things in a way that is shameful and can make it more dangerous, and they take more risks that way. So we want to act as neutrally as we can. So there are things about human development that are completely true across, it doesn't matter, intellectual or developmental disability. This is just typical human sexual development. There's obviously the developmental biological sex, then there's gender assignment, development of gender identity and societal gender role, development of values, and then attitudes about sexuality. Those are all things that happen just throughout human sexual development. That is true across the board. Where people sometimes might be missing those things because they don't have anyone talking to them about it, what might be like those development of values and attitudes about sexuality. If you have someone who has never really had a conversation, they might only be pulling things from TV shows, media, friends, and things like that. So they're not getting values from their family. They're getting them from people outside of their family. Or somebody had mentioned YouTube. You can find anything on YouTube, right? Unfortunately. For human sexual development, so there's let me just go back really quickly. So there's obviously typical human sexual development. And then that also goes into the physical and emotional changes of puberty, development of sexual orientation that usually does not happen until 9, 10 years old, sometimes for some kids a little bit older, development of sexual behavior, and then development of sexual identity. And that, oh, sorry, I went way ahead. Why did it go so far ahead? The development of sexual identity, if it is developed in a way that might be atypical or not very healthy, it can lead to some really challenging sexual behaviors as young adults are getting older. So we know that people develop sexual knowledge and then develop sexual skills, right? So those are two different time frames that happen. So development of development of sexual knowledge happens at younger ages. Okay. These are very, very typical interests and behaviors of young children. Okay, so this is very normal behavior. So understanding their body parts and the functions. Body parts can be kids learn all body parts, right? Like we know how cute it is, like when we're like to a little 2-year-old, where's your nose? And they like point to their nose and all this stuff. These are very typical and normal ways that children develop sexual knowledge. So body parts and functions. So understanding like where they go to the bathroom. It's why little kids get so freaked out about going poop in the toilet, because like they haven't learned yet that like their poop isn't part of their body and they're not losing part of their body. Like it's okay that they're going poop. Like they don't necessarily understand that. So genital touching, normal. When it says sex play, that just means like is like what they see as like female and male, like those roles that have been played out for them. Where did I come from? Completely normal thing to wonder. Again, those roles as male and female. Body image. So what do they see as the adults around them? How do they talk about their bodies? How do they see their bodies? Like, do they see a parent like going to the mirror and being like, oh, I'm so disgusting, you know, or, oh, I hate my arms, or I don't like the way I feel about myself. Like that's all about body image, and they get that from the adults in their life. And then that need for privacy will increase as they are getting a little bit older. They might not want someone to see them taking their shirt off. They might start to realize and get those attitudes from the adults around them. So these are all very typical interests, concerns, and behaviors for young children. Okay. And when it says concerns, it means that the children have concerns about them, not that they are concerning behaviors, if that makes sense. Like the children want to know, like, where did I come from? Funny story, my gender roles, children between the ages of like 3 and 5 tend to have very rigid ideas of gender roles because it's they're very concrete at that age. And my youngest son, when he was in pre-K, like at our house, we've always been like, you know, toys are for people. Like you just play with whatever toys you want to play with. Like if you like dolls, you play with dolls. If you like trucks, you play with trucks, whatever it might be. You just play with what you like, right? Because you're a little kid and that's your job, is to play. And like we've had like all kinds of cups. Like we had like Doc McStuffin cups and all this. And when my son was in pre-K, he would have been 3. He was young when he went into pre-K. He was like, when he went into pre-K, he was like, didn't care about like what cup he used. And when he was in pre-K, like he had a teacher who told him like he could only use like the boy cups. He could only pick like the boy cups. And so he would come home, he would refuse to use anything except that was like a boy cup, because they're very rigid at that age. And it was very normal for him to be super rigid about that one thing of what he saw as like a gender role, right? And like he was a boy, and so boys use blue transformer cups, right? So it's all very normal. Sometimes we put adult ideas and concepts onto children's very normal, typical behaviors. That would be true of, like, for example, if you have a little boy who wants to wear a dress and heels and things like that, that may be because they really love the way that their parent looks in those things, right? It does not necessarily mean that that child is, going to be transgender, or that child has any kind of sexuality. That is an adult concern that we are putting onto a child. All that child knows is that they love their mom so much, like so much, right? And they know that their mom looks beautiful and feels wonderful when they wear a dress, right? And so they aren't there's nothing going on there besides the feelings that that child is having about their parents. So there's we put a lot of adult concerns onto children's very normal, typical behavior. And I think that's sometimes where we can get stuck as adults, is like, that's not what little kids aren't thinking that. They're just thinking about themselves, right? So, okay, so as we move into adolescence, again, very normal interests, concerns of the adolescents and behaviors, physical changes of puberty, pimples, body odor, friendships become more important to them. They might be learning in school about reproduction, pregnancy, birth, pregnancy options, sexual expression, contraception, sexually transmitted infections, sexual feelings, masturbation, all very normal, typical developmental stages that adolescents go through. And yes, that also means adolescents that have intellectual and developmental disabilities. It is very interesting because we often forget that adolescents with intellectual and developmental disabilities are going through these same things. So you may have a teen who, up until this point in their development, has been perfectly happy to stay home, hang out with parents, like go and do things with their family all the time. And then you start to be like, wow, my teenager is just, they're so moody, and like they just don't want to like hang out with me, or they're doing it, but they're doing it begrudgingly. And then you realize that somebody that has an intellectual or developmental disability, they might not have as many opportunities for friendships, right? They might not, they might be in a small sized class. They might not have as many social outlets. They may not be playing a sport, but friendships are just as important to them, right? So that they might not have an outlet for that. They might not have learned things that, like, that masturbation is normal. They might not have realized that eventually, like, they're not going through health class like other kids. And if they are, they might not be sure how it applies to them, because no one may have taken the time, or they might just not be sure, to be honest. They also might not understand what's happening to their body. Bodies are weird things happen to them during puberty. They just might not have any idea what's going on. And so we have to remember that we have to think about these things as they're moving through these very typical developmental stages as well. So things that might be of interest to them or concern to them are the same things as anyone else. Sexual orientation, gender identity, body image. How do they establish relationships? How do they express gender? How do they communicate with their partner? How do they decide that they might have sex? How do they decide for that to be pleasurable? How do they break up? Like, these actually are things probably that most people aren't actually taught about. So this is pretty typical. I don't think that anyone ever told me at all about like that deciding about having sex was like something that you could choose or not choose to do. It was always you choose not to do it, right? Because every single one of the chat messages that we read was the message is don't get pregnant, right? The message wasn't, you know, you can have sex and not get pregnant, and these are the ways that you don't get pregnant, and this is the way that you have a healthy relationship. It was don't get pregnant, right? So these are all things that are going through their minds. Like, we don't teach people how to break up. We don't really teach people how to have communication. So this was actually something that we practiced when I was teaching my class. We would practice, how do you have a healthy fight? What is a healthy fight? What is an unhealthy fight? What does abuse look like? What does a healthy relationship where you're having a conflict with somebody, what does that look like? So these are really important to know, that these situations are going to come up. Someone had asked, what suggestions do you have to address these situations? It would depend on what you mean about, like, what situation. If you don't feel comfortable talking to your kid or your child about these, there are organizations and people that will. You can find them online. ElevatUs, I think, actually does have one. I'm not sure if they do it virtually or not. They might do it virtually, but when I was doing it with people, like, these are things that we would practice. These were conversations that we had. We did role plays. We actually pretended to break up. There's a lot when you're having these conversations, especially if somebody does have an intellectual or developmental disability, giving lots of different ways to learn about this can be really helpful. So meaning, like, do you watch videos together, right? Like, maybe, I'm sure you can find on YouTube, because there's lots of bad stuff and there's lots of good stuff. Like, you can find about, like, what does a healthy fight look like? And watch that with them, and then talk about it. If it's somebody that isn't verbal or might be non-speaking, like, you can still watch things together. You can still have conversations. A lot of people that are non-speaking, they have communication devices, and whatever that may look like. There's ways to have these conversations. If you don't feel like someone would be comfortable having this conversation one-on-one, have this conversation with somebody else while they are in the room, and you can tell that they're listening, right? Like, you don't always have to have it directly. You can have it indirectly if you need to, especially at first. And then they might realize, oh, so-and-so is a safe person that I can have this conversation with. Or I heard them talking to this person the other day about having a healthy fight. And, maybe that's something I can ask them about, or whatever it might be. There's a lot of different ways that it can be done. Hold on one second. Somebody asked if there's a resource. There actually are some resources that are in a sheet that I'm going to send Taylor all of my resources, and she can send them out to the participants. That way, because sometimes people struggle to get it, to download things from the chat. So I'm just going to have her send that out. Adults, things that are of interest to people that are adults with disabilities would be things like pregnancy or birth, parenting, contraception, sexually transmitted infections, masturbation, sexual orientation, gender identity. There is on, hold on, let me think. It's the Self-Advocates of New York State. The Self-Advocates of New York State, I'm going to, let me just put that in the chat. So it's the Self-Advocates of New York State. They have on their website some amazing videos about sexuality and developmental disabilities, or sexual orientation and gender identity, and developmental disabilities. They are videos that are made by people with disabilities. There's about between maybe 5 and 10 on there. I went to a conference for the Self-Advocates of New York State, and they showed the videos, they talked about them. They were the individuals who had made the videos, and they were just really informative. And they're short. They're like 2 minutes. You can absolutely share them with people that you care about. And it's nice because it's not just like some neurotypical person like going in there and like lecturing them or talking to them. It's people with a disability is making these videos. It's very empowering. So that I found those really helpful when I was looking through this. More concerns of adults would be establishing and maintaining intimate relationships, separation and divorce, body image, menopause, changes in sexual functioning. Again, all things that happens to adults. Have you ever heard of a workshop, training, educational, anything on menopause for women that have developmental disabilities? Because I never have. People that do not have developmental disabilities, it's hard to find good information out there about menopause. We don't talk about it, right? Like we don't have conversations about it. These are things that are happening. These are things that are happening to everyone's bodies. Okay. All right, let's keep moving. So how is a person, and because again, we don't really have a way to have like small group discussions, how is a person with a developmental disabilities experience of developing physically or emotionally the same as someone without a disability? And how is a person with a developmental disabilities experience of developing different than someone without a disability? So how is it the same and how is it different? Anybody have any ideas? I actually do tell you in a minute, just in case anybody doesn't. But you can feel free to write in the chat.
I feel like it's the way that they could understand. We as they have a way different way to understand things that as we do. So I think it's that.
Yeah. So kind of an understanding, a knowledge, even access or information. So things that are the same would be assigned gender. Somebody had said increased sensory. Yep. Different would be understanding of the experience of developing. Yep. Biological changes, gender roles. Absolutely, you can see the gender roles. If you go into any classroom, like you can see that gender roles are the same, whether you have a disability or not. Biological changes, all the same. As I said, they need the same information based on their biological age. When you have a young person who is going through puberty and you have, say, a young man who has a penis and all of a sudden they start waking up and they're waking up in the middle of the night and they have an erection and they don't understand why, that is going to be the same based on their biological age, not based on their developmental age. And they're going to wonder why, and they're going to be scared and confused if they do not know what's happening, right? Having sexual feelings and needs, that does not change based on someone's intellectual age. We know that to be true. We absolutely see it anywhere that is somebody that has a disability. Those sexual feelings do not go away. There might not be the same cognitive awareness of them, but they are not gone, right? They're not eunuchs. They aren't people that don't have hormones or biology. That is the same. They have dreams like anyone else, having a relationship, maybe having children. Those things are the same, right? They just might not have an outlet for that. for example, one of the young women in the class that I taught, like she would talk about wanting to have a boyfriend. This was the same one that her parents talked to her about stuff. She was pretty knowledgeable. But when she was 18, she was gonna get a boyfriend and he was gonna have a motorcycle. And that was her dream, right? So those dreams still exist. They're still there. That is absolutely the same. Things that are different are things that we can change. Hold on one second. So the things that are different are things that we generally have control over and that we can do something about. The things that are the same, we can't do anything about. The things that are different are things that we can change. So a lack of basic sexuality information and skills, they are either considered asexual, meaning they have no sexual feelings at all, or they're oversexed. You see instances of that quite significantly, where you have maybe a young woman who has an intellectual disability who is over-sexualized in school, or like, that's the girl who will do anything. They are considered children. Things that are behaviors that are accepted or forgiven. They're overly protected. Sometimes there's that instance of, the young adult or even the adult who inappropriately hugs people, inappropriately hugs staff members, hugs them too long. Maybe it touches them inappropriately when they're hugging them. And that's allowed to happen because they're considered children. Those behaviors are accepted, where in a different situation, that behavior would not be accepted. So it might be the nature of their disability. They're not picking up on social cues. They might need additional topics. They might have trouble identifying emotions. You can educate someone on that. It might not naturally be happening, but that is an education that can happen in natural environments like school, natural social environments. Those lack of friendships, social opportunities, that missed informal learning, the loneliness, those are things that are different. What I have found in my professional experience is that there is a lack of a social outlet for people that have intellectual and developmental disabilities, unless it's highly monitored, and there's not a lot of learning that necessarily happens. Like social cues are something that can be taught. You can learn how to have social norms, right? And some of that is that we don't necessarily allow people with developmental disabilities to socialize with people without them. And so there is a lack of that, what would be typical social learning. Oftentimes people have a lack of privacy to explore their sexuality, whether that is because they are seen as asexual. So like they're not allowed to explore any of that. Like everybody should have access to privacy. If they live in any sort of like group living environment, we are often telling them that they shouldn't have privacy. They don't need to do those things. Many parents let go of their dreams for their child related to their sexuality or think of them as not sexual. They worry about higher rates of abuse. I do feel like that is accurate. I mean, statistically, we do know that people that have intellectual and developmental disabilities are abused at higher rates, but part of that is a lack of education. Knowing that the topics have to be taught differently, and just having a wide range of abilities and limitations, like those are all things that can be accounted for when you are giving somebody education about these topics. I, many years ago, worked direct care with a couple that lived on their own. They both had intellectual disabilities. They both held down jobs. They were married to each other. and they were just a lovely couple. Like, they just loved each other and they liked to do the same things. And one of their favorite things was to go and walk around the grocery store and hold hands and buy their groceries together. And their families allowed them to freedom to be able to explore that. And they were married for years and years and years. By the time I knew them, they'd already been married like 15 years. You can, if you search, like, you can search the internet and you can find so many stories of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have very loving, kind relationships. And one way that happens is that they were given opportunities to do that. And even if you watch like Love on the Spectrum or Down with Love, like, you can see it on just regular TV now, how those things can happen. And one of the ways that those happen is, even in those shows, there is an element of teaching. The people receive social coaches, they receive relationship coaching, and they receive skills and tools to be able to have relationships, because they just have to be taught things in a different way. Tips: if you are having these conversations with your children or young adults that you may be working with or interacting with, you may have to initiate the conversations. This is very likely going to be true if you have somebody that is nonverbal or non-speaking. You, just like a lot of things, when you have someone who's non-speaking, you are going to have to learn their cues. You are going to have to know. You might say things like, if there's a TV show on, or there's a book, or there's a video that they're watching, and if you're watching it together, you may say, oh, I see that that's a couple they just gave each other a kiss. That probably feels nice for them. You don't have to ask them a question. You don't have to have any response, but initiating that you are a safe and okay person to, I don't even want to say broach the topic, because if somebody is non-speaking, they might not be talking to you about it, but to know that you are noticing those things. Or if you have somebody who is, I'm just off the top of my head here, I'm thinking of like a young person who maybe you notice is like really, really loves a certain like actor or actress on TV. Oh, I noticed that you really like watching Reese Witherspoon. Maybe you think that she's pretty, or maybe you like her hair, or, I noticed that you really enjoy watching movies with this actor or actress in them. Maybe you like the way that they look, or maybe you like their voice. You don't have to have an in-depth conversation about sexuality or sex or anything like that to start this. Like, it does not have to start that way. It can start as simple as noticing the things that they are noticing and watching, right? It doesn't have to be super detailed. You don't have to be asking a lot of questions, because a couple of people have asked about somebody that is nonverbal or non-speaking, or maybe the intellectual or developmental disability and the barriers that they have does leave them with limited access to some of that information. You can just notice what they're doing, and you can say that out loud to them. You could say something like, I notice that your body is changing, or I see that you're very interested in, the girls in your class. It doesn't have to be huge. We don't have to start with like a big conversation about puberty and what goes where when you're having sex. Like, you don't have to do that. It can start simple, right? It's one of the most important things to remember, that it is okay to feel embarrassed. It's okay to not know the answer, and it's okay to say, you know what, I don't really know the answer to that. I'm going to look it up and I'm going to get back to you. Or I'm super embarrassed by that question, but I don't feel bad that you asked it. Why don't you give me like 5 to 10 minutes and I'll come back and then we can talk about it. Or if you know, like even just saying to somebody, oh my gosh, when you ask me those questions, my face gets so red and I get so embarrassed. But it's okay. Let's have the conversation anyway. And so you're leaving the space for them to come back to you. You're not blowing them off. You're not acting like it's a question that is gross and disgusting. You are acknowledging what's happening to you. You're acknowledging that it might be a hard topic to talk about, but you're bringing them in instead of pushing them away, right? If you are in a public place, it's okay to say to them, I heard your question. That's a private question. Let's talk about that when we get home. Same thing with if there's a behavior that is happening in public that is not a public type of behavior, it's okay to say that same sort of thing. You want to give age appropriate information. One of the things that is true is trying to give a consistent message. And that consistent message should be, I'm a safe person to talk to, not to react. That's kind of what I went over earlier, not to be like, oh, that's so disgusting, or, oh, you got to put that away, or whatever it is. Like, you don't want to act like it's, oh God, the grossest thing. Practicing, it sounds really funny, but we get better at things. It's like muscle memory, right? Like we get better at things the more that we do them. I wish that we had kind of the ability to practice this. It is pretty hard to do when we're virtual, but practice it at home. I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna send this stuff out to Taylor so she can send it out to the participants and kind of see what is useful to you. In the moments, when you're using teachable moments, it's a really good time to be factual. So reassuring the person that that's a good question to ask. Find out what the person thinks or is really asking. It can be really embarrassing if you assume that you know what the person is saying, but that's not actually their question. Like, if you have a little kid who's, or even like a young adult who says something like, what happens when you bleed? And you're like, oh my God. And you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, they're asking about periods. I don't know what to tell them. I don't know, how do I have this conversation? And like you're spiraling in your mind and you say to them, oh, but out on the outside, you're like, oh, what do you mean by what happens when you bleed? And they're like, well, I caught my finger on my zipper. And so my finger's bleeding. And I just wanted to know, like, will all of my blood come out? And then you realize like you spiraled for no reason because that wasn't actually the question they were asking. So just clarifying what that is. Deciding what message you want to give. This is something that you want to try to decide if as consistently as possible if you have a if there's multiple parents, multiple people in the family, you want to try to have a consistent message. This is going to sound funny. It's going to get explained in a second, but using medical terminology, it sounds like it would make it complicated, but it actually makes it less complicated for people. So if somebody is like, well, what's a period? Explaining it simply, if you go into the whole like, oh, well, there is the uterine lining and all of that stuff, like you can just say, very simply in medical terms, a period is a monthly cycle that a woman has that releases blood from their body. So you're using medical terminology, you're not making it super complicated, but you're answering the question. Encouraging the person to give feedback. So you could say, what did you think about what I just told you? Is important because like maybe they don't understand it, maybe they do, or maybe they have it completely wrong. So we're gonna get to this. So answering a factual question, it actually has a method. It's called the Scarborough method, and the way to do it is a physical. So what are the physical aspects of it? What is the social aspect of it? And what is the emotional aspect of it? I'm gonna see example. Okay, So this would be an example. So what is a condom? You get your kid asks you, what is a condom? The Scarborough method of answering that is a condom is a rubber sock that covers a penis. It's a private thing to do. It protects you and your partner when you're having sex. Many people feel good when they use them because they're being responsible and protecting themselves and their partner. That incorporates all three aspects of the Scarborough method. It gives people a really clear way of yeah, that's what we'll send out the information. It gives people a really clear way to answer. It takes out a lot of that fear that people have about answering these questions. And it gives people the opportunity to ask another question. So, okay, well, it's a sock. Like, does it live in my drawer? No, it's something that you use one time, you throw it away, right? So it gives the opportunity for questions and follow-up without getting super duper complicated. Number 2, your 14-year-old daughter has recently begun having her period. One day when she returns from school, you see blood on her pants. We're gonna talk about that one because it's very clear. Okay. So one way, if that's true, okay, we're gonna answer it based on the factual method. Okay, so we're gonna go back to this. Where did it go? Sorry, they moved stuff. Hold on. Okay, so the factual method. That's Scarborough. It's almost like they moved it or they took that slide out. Okay, well, we're just gonna go with this one. So, your daughter's in. So the first thing that we would want to do is we would want to go to this. The physical is period is a cycle that a woman has that releases blood from her body every month. Sometimes people have that, and so the social part of it would be all people who have a uterus have a period. And then the emotional part would be sometimes when you have your period, it can make you feel cranky or upset, or you might feel headachy. And that is something that you have to be kind to yourself about. So you want to make sure that you're giving them each of these pieces, because if you just tell them one piece of it, if you just say the physical, if you just say, oh, well, a period is something that you have, that women with a uterus have every month, and it's the blood coming out of the uterus. If you just tell them that part, they're not going to understand the emotional part that happens too. So that's a really critical part of this method, because you're not giving them all the information. So I'm going to go forward a little bit. I really wish that we could go through all of these, but I know it's always harder virtual, and that's totally fine. But these are scenarios that have all happened. So something like, well, you're at the grocery store, you see your daughter give a big hug to the store clerk. If we might not be practicing these methods, for me, that would just be like, I might panic at that, right? But if we can give the young adult something very concrete to be able to understand why they can't just go up to a store clerk and give them a hug without scaring them, but doing it in an appropriate way, it's going to help them understand boundaries, know what it's possible for them to do. It's really critical that we teach people that they have autonomy over their own body and that there's boundaries around other people's bodies as well. I'm not going to do this with you because we are out of time for the evening. But I mean, I am also willing to stay and answer questions. I know that the Special Olympics wanted to make sure that people had some privacy to be able to do that. But I want you to think about this 3 positive messages that you want to give your kids about sexuality. So just think about it for yourself. I'm happy to stay and answer some questions. If people have any, I know a couple of people have left already, but I'm happy to do that. Sometimes it's easier with something like this to answer a question individually because they can be private, a little bit private.
So as we wrap up tonight, I just want to say a huge thank you to Emily for all of the information you've shared tonight. You know, I know just looking at the chat that a lot of folks have found it super valuable. And as I mentioned, I will be sharing this recording and the resources that Emily will pass along later in the week after we've uploaded the recording. I did put a link in the chat that is a Microsoft form. So this is an option if you have any questions, comments, or feedback that you'd like to share, whether that's something that comes up, you know, in the next couple of days, or potentially you have a question that you would rather ask and have forwarded on to Emily. We are very much willing to do that for you as well. So we're happy to stay on if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask. Otherwise, I'll be sending out an email with the recording and those resources, and also a link to our November opportunity, which will be regarding transitioning to adult and employment services, which will be hosted by the AHRC New York City in November on the 19th. So with that, if there are any other questions, please feel free to throw them out there.